This story is called Daughter Proudly Cheated with Her Sister's Husband, Now Begs Us to Take Her In After He Cheated and Dumped Her. We put a lot of time and effort into finding these stories to keep bringing you the best content. Thanks for your support. It really makes a difference and helps us keep going strong. Thanks for being here with us. Now let's start the video. The video starts by saying, "Hey Reddit. I never thought I'd be sharing something like this here, but I don't even know where else to turn. My family has been over the last few years, I've been through a lot. I'm still trying to process everything that's happened. I've decided to write it all down to help me understand it better. I'd also appreciate advice or just an outside perspective. So, I'll start from the beginning. I'm a 48-year-old mom of 3 kids, Sarah, 27, Emily, 25, and Alex, 21. My husband is 53 and I've been married to him for nearly 3 decades. Up until a few years ago, I really thought we had a solid, happy family. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't? Looking back now, I can't believe how naive I was. This all started about 3 years ago. At the time, Sarah was married to Jake, who was 28. They'd been together for years and seemed like one of those couples who had it all figured out. I loved Jake like my own son, and Sarah seemed genuinely happy with him. But everything fell apart in the worst way possible. That time, Sarah went through something really traumatic. I don't want to share too many details because it's her story, not mine. Let's just say it was the kind of thing that changes a person forever. She was struggling to cope, and I could see it in everything she did. Her eyes were always red from crying. She started jumping at every little noise and isolating herself from everyone, even her family. It was heartbreaking to watch and I felt so helpless. Then, as if that wasn't bad enough, we found out that Jake had been cheating on Sarah with her younger sister Emily. I can't even describe the moment I found out. It felt like someone had ripped my heart out of my chest and stomped on it. The worst part was that I didn't even hear it from Emily or Jake. I found out from Sarah after she caught them. Sarah was completely crushed. I've never seen her like that in my entire life, and I hope I never do again. When I confronted Emily, I thought she'd at least have the decency to offer an apology or something. Instead, she just shrugged and said, "Well, someone had to take care of Jake since Sarah wasn't." I was stunned. She said it so casually, like it was no big deal. I couldn't believe my own daughter was capable of saying something like that. I was so angry that I had to leave the room before I did something I'd regret. That was the moment I decided I couldn't have Emily in my life, not until she understood the gravity of what she'd done. I told her in no uncertain terms that she needed to stay away from me, her father and most importantly Sarah. First, she tried to argue, but when she saw I wasn't going to budge, she started screaming. She said things like, "You're choosing Sarah over me," and "You're such a hypocrite." But honestly, her words didn't mean anything to me in that moment. I was done. Meanwhile, Sarah was barely holding on. She blamed herself for everything, including Jake's infidelity, the fallout with her sister, and even the traumatic event that had happened to her. No matter how many times I told her it wasn't her fault, she just couldn't believe it. She kept saying, "Maybe if I had been a better wife, this wouldn't have happened." It broke my heart every time. We ended up getting Sarah into we made the decision to go to therapy, which was probably the best one we made during that time. At first, she was reluctant to go, but over time, she started to open up. We knew that therapy wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it gave her the tools she needed to start healing. She began to find herself again, and she even started going out. With friends and hobbies she'd given up on, she was starting to smile again. It was like a breath of fresh air. Emily, on the other hand, didn't seem to have any remorse for what she'd done. After Sarah and Jake finalized their divorce, Emily and Jake went public with their relationship. They didn't even try to be discreet about it. They posted pictures together on social media, went on trips and acted like nothing had happened. It was infuriating, to say the least. Then came the ultimate slap in the face. Emily and Jake announced their engagement. I found out through Alex, who called me in disbelief. After seeing their engagement party photos online, Emily had the nerve to ask me and my husband to come to the wedding. I was pretty shocked, so I told her straight up that I couldn't support their relationship and that I wouldn't be attending. My husband felt the same way. Emily tried to argue, saying things like, "You're being unfair and Jake loves me, Mom, why can't you just be happy for me?" But I wasn't having it. I also gave her a warning, which I still stand by to this day. If Jake cheated with you, he'll cheat on you. It's only a matter of time. She didn't take that well, but honestly, I didn't care. My priority was and still is protecting. It was so unfair. Jake loves me, Mom. Why can't you just be happy for me? I wasn't having it. I also gave her a warning, which I still stand by to this day. If Jake cheated with you, he'll cheat on you. It's only a matter of time. She didn't take that well, but honestly, I didn't care. My priority was and still is protecting Sarah. Looking back on that time, I can't believe how much our family changed in such a short period. What once felt like a strong, unbreakable bond was completely shattered. I barely recognized Emily anymore. And my relationship with her hasn't been the same since. As much as it hurts to say, I don't think I still love my daughter, but I can't forgive her for what she did to Sarah. I want to believe she can change, but I'm not holding my breath. After cutting contact with Emily following the fallout, I honestly thought things couldn't get worse. How much more damage could she do? I didn't realize just how selfish she was. She stayed quiet for a while and didn't reach out to me or her dad, which was a relief. But it didn't last long. One day Alex, my youngest, came storming into the house with his phone in his hand. I'll never forget the look on his face. He handed me his phone and said, "Have you seen this?" I looked and saw a photo of Emily and Jake, arms wrapped around each other, all smiles. My daughter was engaged to the man who had not only betrayed her sister but also contributed to the lowest point in her life. It felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the engagement itself, it was the way they flaunted it. They didn't seem to care how it would affect anyone else, especially Sarah. I wasn't sure how to break the news to Sarah. She was finally starting to make progress in therapy and I didn't want to undo all that by bringing this up. But at the same time, I knew she'd find out eventually and I didn't want her to feel blindsided. So I sat her down and told her as gently as I could. Her face fell. She sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then she said, "I knew they were together, but I didn't think they'd actually take it this far." She didn't cry, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. It was like she'd been stabbed all over again. After that, I decided to reach out to Emily. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but I felt like I needed to say something, if not for my sake then for Sarah's. I called her and surprisingly she picked up. I told her how hurtful her actions were and that getting engaged to Jake was just pouring salt in the wound. Her response was, "Mom, you just don't understand Jake. I love Sarah and I think she loves me. What she and Jake had is over. Why can't you just be happy for me and happy for her?" I couldn't believe she had the nerve to say that. I told her in no uncertain terms that I would not support her relationship with Jake. I also warned her again that if Jake could cheat on Sarah, he could just as easily. She said that Jake was a different person with her and that I'd see. That was the last time we spoke for a while. Then came the engagement party. I didn't go, but Alex did. He said he didn't want to support them, but he was curious to see how it would all play out. The party was everything you'd expect from Emily and Jake, flashy, over the top and completely devoid of self-awareness. They even had the audacity to post photos on social media with captions like "True love wins" and "Can't wait to spend forever with you." The comment section was a mess, with some people congratulating them and others calling them out for their terrible behavior. Some people called them out for their terrible behavior. It was a bit of a circus. Alex also told me that some of the extended family showed up, which was surprising. I later found out that most of them didn't know the full story. They thought Emily and Jake had gotten together after the divorce, not during Sarah and Jake's marriage. When the truth came out, a lot of them were furious. One of my sisters even called me to apologize for attending, saying she had no idea what Emily had done. Meanwhile, Sarah was trying her best to move on. She stopped following Emily and Jake on social media. And she asked us not to mention them around her. I respected her wishes, but it was difficult to avoid the topic entirely, especially with Alex constantly updating me on their antics. He was just as angry as I was, if not more. He kept saying things like, "How can she not see how wrong this is? Jake is such a scumbag. I don't know how she can stand him. As for my husband, he stayed quiet for the most part. He's always been the calm, steady one in our relationship. But I could tell he was just as upset as I was. One night after a particularly rough day, he sat down next to me and said, "I don't know where we went wrong with Emily. I thought we raised her better than this." That really hit me. It was tough. I'd been asking myself the same question, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel so much more real. The engagement eventually turned into wedding planning. I tried to tune it out as much as possible, but Emily kept finding ways to involve me, even though I'd made my stance clear. She'd send me text messages with things like, "Mom, do you want to help me pick out a dress?" or "We're looking at venues next weekend. Wanna come?" I replied with a polite but firm no. I thought she'd get the hint, but she didn't. Then, out of nowhere, she called me one evening. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. She sounded really excited and said, "Mom, I really want you and Dad to walk me down the aisle. It would mean so much to me." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so I told her as gently as I could that we couldn't support her wedding, not because we didn't love her, but because of everything that had happened. She started crying. She said I was choosing Sarah over her again. Why can't I just let this go? That was really hurtful, but I stood my ground. I told her this wasn't about choosing one daughter over the other. It was about doing what was right. That conversation ended with her hanging up on me. I haven't heard from her since. To be honest, I'm okay with that. I miss the Emily I used to know, but I can't let her actions go unchecked. She needs to understand that her choices have consequences. After the fiasco with the engagement party and Emily's increasingly tone-deaf attempts to involve us in her wedding plans, things went eerily quiet. I didn't hear from her for a while. I haven't heard from Emily, Jake, or even much from the extended family, to be honest. I thought maybe they had finally accepted our stance and decided to move on without us. It was bittersweet. On one hand, it felt like a relief not to deal with the drama, but on the other, I couldn't shake the sadness of knowing how fractured our family had become a bit fractured. Sarah was trying to move on, but I could see how much this situation was still affecting her. She was setting boundaries with the family, avoiding gatherings where she thought Emily or Jake might show up. One time we had a small family barbecue planned, and she specifically asked, or I told her they weren't invited, but she still asked if they were going to be there. It broke my heart that she had to ask. She should have been able to feel safe with her own family, but she wasn't. One night, Sarah and I were sitting in the living room, and she opened up to me about how she really felt. "Mom, I don't think I'll ever forgive her," she said, staring at the floor. "Not just for Jake, but for the way she treated me when I was at my lowest. She didn't just betray me, she enjoyed it. She didn't care what it did to me." Hearing her say that was like a knife to the heart. I didn't know how to respond because, honestly, I could understand why she felt that way. Emily's actions had been so callous and she had shown no remorse. Around this time, Alex started pulling away from Emily too. He had been furious about her actions from the start, but he'd still kept in touch with her, mostly out of a sense of obligation. One day he came to me and said, "Mom, I can't take it anymore. Every time I talk to her, she acts like she's the victim in all this. I'm sick of it." He stopped answering her calls and unfollowed her on social media. I think that was the wake-up call Emily needed because not long after, she started reaching out to me again. At first it was just small things. She started sending me texts again, asking how we were doing or giving updates about the wedding. I kept my responses short and polite, but I didn't engage much. Then, out of nowhere, she sent me this long message about how much she missed our family and how hard it was to plan a wedding without her parents' support. She even said something along the lines of, "I know I've made mistakes, but can't we just move forward?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I wrote, "Emily, I love you, but you need to take responsibility for the pain you've caused before we can even think about moving forward." Her reply was immediate and defensive. She said she had nothing to apologize for because she and Jake were meant to be and that if Sarah couldn't handle that, it wasn't her fault. I didn't respond after that. I didn't see the point. A few months later, Emily and Jake got married in what I assume was a beautiful ceremony, though I wouldn't know because I didn't go. I heard that some family members who did go felt awkward the entire time. One of my cousins even texted me afterwards to say it felt like everyone was pretending not to notice the elephant in the room. I wish I'd stayed home. After the wedding, things went quiet again. Emily didn't. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. I thought that perhaps she'd finally moved on. Sarah started to seem a little more cheerful and outgoing. She was going out more and laughing more. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I started to feel hopeful that maybe, just maybe, we could put this whole mess behind us. But then, out of nowhere, Emily turned up at my house one rainy evening. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard a frantic knock at the door. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor needing something, but when I opened the door, there was Emily, soaking wet, crying and holding a baby in a toddler carrier. I was so shocked. I didn't know what to say. She just stood there looking completely defeated. Finally, she said, "Mom, I need your help." I let her in, even though I was angry at her. I couldn't turn her away, not with the kids there. She sat on the couch, still sobbing, while I got her a towel and tried to calm her down. Once she finally, after catching her breath, she started telling me what had happened. It seems that Jake had been emotionally and verbally abusive for months. He'd been controlling and constantly putting her down. In addition, he had another woman on the side. She said that he has a whole other family. "I can't go back there," she said, through tears. Hearing this stirred up a lot of emotions. On the one hand, I felt for her. No one deserves to be treated like that. But on the other hand, I couldn't help thinking, you chose this. You knew who he was, and you still chose him over your sister and your family. It was a hard thing to reconcile. Emily begged me to let her. The kids are staying with us because she said she had nowhere else to go and didn't know what to do. I told her I needed time to think about it and I didn't want to make any rash decisions, especially knowing how this might affect Sarah. After everything she's been through, I couldn't risk doing anything that might set her back. That night, I told my husband what had happened. He was just as conflicted as I was. "We can't just turn her away," he said, "but we also can't ignore how much she's hurt Sarah." It felt like we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. No matter what we decided, someone was going to get hurt. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept going over everything in my mind: Emily's betrayal, Sarah's pain, Jake's awful behavior. I didn't know what the right thing to do was, but I knew one thing for sure: whatever decision I made, it had to be for the good of the family as a whole, not just for Emily, not just for Sarah, but for everyone. Emily turned up at my door with her kids. My life was thrown into chaos yet again. I spent most of that first night sitting up in the living room, staring at her, sleeping on the couch with her baby in her arms. The toddler was curled up on the floor beside her, clutching a worn-out stuffed animal. It was such a stark contrast. She looked different to the confident, even smug version of Emily I'd seen over the past few years. She looked fragile, broken, and I didn't know what to make of it. When morning came, I decided I couldn't put off the conversation any longer. I gently woke her up and handed her a cup of coffee. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded. I asked her to tell me everything: how she ended up in this situation, why she came to me, what she wanted me to do. She told me that things with Jake had started falling apart not long after they got married. She said he'd become controlling, monitoring her phone and criticizing her. She tried to brush it off at first, thinking it was just stress or maybe some growing pains as they adjusted to married life. But then he started disappearing for long stretches of time, and she began to suspect he was cheating. It wasn't until she found text and photos that I listened quietly. My sister let her get it all out. Part of me wanted to say, "Over a year, what did you do?" But I bit my trembling lip. "I need a baby to the lecture, not yet anyway." When she finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I know I've messed up, Mom, but I don't have anyone else to turn to." That's when I started to feel guilty, even though I hated what Emily had done. She was still my daughter, and those kids were my grandkids. I told her I needed time to think about it and I wasn't making any promises. She nodded and said she understood, but I could tell she was disappointed. I decided the next step was to talk to Sarah. I couldn't make a decision about Emily without considering how it would affect her that afternoon. I called her and asked if she could come over. She sounded hesitant but agreed. When Sarah arrived, she immediately noticed Emily's things in the hallway. Her face fell, and I knew this conversation was going to be tough. I had thought it would be easier than it was. We sat down at the kitchen table and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her about Emily's troubles with Jake and how she'd shown up at our door with nowhere else to go. Sarah listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she took a deep breath. And she said, "Mom, I get that you want to help her, but you have to understand I can't be around her, not after everything she's done. I've worked so hard to move on and I just can't go backward." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I knew she was right. Having Emily around would reopen wounds that I'd spent years trying to move on, but I couldn't just abandon Emily and her kids. It felt like I was being forced to choose between my daughters, and it was tearing me apart. My husband was just as conflicted as I was. That evening, we sat down to talk about it, and he said, "I don't think there's a right. There's no perfect answer here. No matter what we do, someone's going to get hurt." He suggested we look into alternative solutions, like helping Emily find a place to stay nearby so she wouldn't be in the house, but would still have support. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it felt like the best compromise we could come up with. The next day I told Emily about our decision. I explained that while we couldn't have her staying with us, we would help her find an apartment and cover the first month's rent. I also offered to help with daycare for the kids so she could look for a job. I expected her to be grateful or at least understanding, but instead she got angry and said, "This is my family. How can you just turn me away like this after everything I've been through? How much longer are you going to coddle her?" That was the moment my husband lost his temper. My husband and I sat in silence for the next few days. I tried to smooth things over with Emily. I found her a one-bedroom apartment and helped her get in touch with a lawyer to start the divorce process. She remained distant and cold, barely speaking to me unless it was absolutely necessary. It was clear she felt betrayed, but I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. She was finally facing the consequences of her actions, and while it was painful to watch, I knew it was necessary. As for Sarah, I made a point to check in with her regularly and reassure her that she was my priority. She seemed relieved when I told her that Emily wasn't going to be staying with us, but I could tell that the whole situation was still weighing on her. She said one day that she just wanted things to go back to how they used to be, but I knew that they never would. She was right, no matter what I did, our family would never be the same. But I had to believe that we could. We needed to find a way to move forward, maybe not as the happy, united family we once were, but as something new, something that worked for everyone. Once Emily moved into the small apartment, my husband and I helped her secure. I thought things might settle down, but it wasn't ideal. In fact, it seemed like a step backward. At least she had somewhere to live and a place to regroup. We also paid for a couple of weeks of daycare for the kids so she could start job hunting. It was the best we could do under the circumstances, especially since tensions were still high between her and the rest of the family. But things didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. Emily would be grateful for the help, but she seemed to resent it. She kept complaining about the size of the apartment, the lack of amenities, and the area, which was not unsafe but definitely not luxurious. I tried to remind her that it was temporary and that she needed to focus on rebuilding her life, but I wasn't having it. "I can't live like this, Mom," she said during one of our phone calls. "I have 2 kids. They deserve better than this." I bit my tongue, wanting to say, they deserve better than Jake too. But here we are. Instead, I calmly reminded her that this was a starting point, not a permanent situation. I told her that she'd have to put in the work and that this wasn't going to fix itself overnight. The job hunt wasn't going well either. Emily hadn't worked in years and her resume was practically empty. She'd applied to a few places, mostly retail and customer service jobs, but she didn't seem motivated to follow up. One day, she said, as if she'd already accepted it was a lost cause. It was frustrating to see her so defeated, especially knowing she had no choice but to make it work. But no matter how much I tried to encourage her, it felt like my words were falling on deaf ears. Meanwhile, the rest of the family we were still getting over her sudden reappearance. Word had spread that Emily was back in town and staying in an apartment we'd helped her find. Some of my siblings called to voice their opinions, most of them negative. "After what she did to Sarah, you're still helping her," one of them said. You're enabling her, you know. I didn't like hearing that, but I understood where they were coming from. From the outside, it probably looked like I was rewarding Emily's bad behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on her entirely, especially when there were two innocent kids involved. I had to remind myself that helping her didn't mean I was excusing her actions. It just meant I wasn't willing to let her hit rock bottom with no safety net. As for Sarah, she was keeping her distance. We hadn't told her the full details of how we were helping Emily. We only told her that Emily wasn't staying with us. I didn't want to burden her with more than she needed to know. I also didn't want her to be caught off guard if she ran into Emily somewhere, so one day I brought it up gently. I told her that Emily was staying in an apartment across town and that we helped her with the first month's rent, but that she'd have to find her own place after that. Sarah nodded, her face unreadable. You do something like that, she said. It's fine, I just don't want to be involved. Her response was calm, but it felt like there was an undercurrent of hurt. I knew she was trying to be understanding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was putting a strain on our relationship. Then there was Alex. He was furious when he found out we were helping Emily at all. Why are you going to such lengths for her after everything she's done? He asked one night. She doesn't deserve it, I said. I tried to explain that it wasn't about what Emily deserved. It was about doing what I felt was right. Her kids are innocent in all of this, I said. They need stability, and if we can help provide it, then we should. I think we should give her a chance, but Alex wasn't convinced. He said she'd never change if we kept bailing her out. His words stung because deep down, I knew there was some truth to them. But what was the alternative? Letting Emily sink completely. I wasn't sure I could live with that. With that, Emily's struggles began to affect her emotionally. She called me one night in tears, saying she felt like a failure. She said I'd ruined everything, her marriage, her relationship with Sarah, and her whole life. She said she didn't even know who she was anymore. It was the first time she'd shown any real self-awareness. I was caught off guard for a moment and thought I saw a glimmer of hope that maybe this was her turning point. But that hope was short-lived. The next time I spoke to her, she was back to blaming everyone but herself. She said that if Jake hadn't treated her badly, she wouldn't be in this mess. And if Sarah had just forgiven her, maybe things wouldn't be so bad if she'd take responsibility for her actions. It was exhausting trying to manage Emily's situation, support Sarah, and deal with the fallout from the rest of the family. I was constantly walking on eggshells, questioning whether I was making the right choices or just digging myself into a deeper hole. The breaking point came when Emily showed up at our house unexpectedly one evening. She looked tired and frazzled, with the kids clinging to her legs. I needed to stay there just for a few nights. A few nights later, she said, my heart sank. Emily, we've been over this. I said, you can't stay here. It's not fair to Sarah. Her face crumpled and she started crying. I don't know what else to do. She said, I'm trying, Mom, but nothing's working. I feel like I'm drowning. I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt, but I held firm. I will help. I said, you can find more resources, but you can't stay here. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd made the right call. I wanted to believe that tough love was the answer, but part of me worried that I was just pushing Emily further away. At the same time, I had to ignore the damage it would do to Sarah if I let Emily move back in. No matter what I did, I felt like I was failing one of my daughters. But after that night when Emily showed up at our house begging to stay, things changed. I could feel the shift, not just with her but within myself. The guilt that had been weighing on me, the problem didn't go away. It transformed into something else. I realized I couldn't keep trying to fix everything to hold together a family that was already fractured. Some things I decided had to be left to time. The first step was enforcing boundaries. It wasn't easy. Emily called almost daily, asking for help with this or that. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was advice. Sometimes it was just someone to vent to. But every call left me emotionally drained. I had to start saying no. Emily, you need to figure this out. That's what I told her during one particularly tense phone call. We've done everything we can to help you get back on your feet. Now it's time for you to do your part. It was time for a change. She wasn't happy about it. She said I was giving up on her. I explained that wasn't the case. I was just giving her the chance to stand on her own. She ended the call. We didn't speak for a while. I focused my energy on rebuilding my relationship with Sarah. She'd been distant ever since Emily. I re-entered the picture, and I could understand why. I had been so caught up in managing Emily's crisis that I hadn't given enough attention to Sarah's feelings. One evening I invited her over for dinner, just the two of us. I wanted to create a safe space where she could speak freely. At first the conversation was light, work, hobbies, her friends. But eventually the conversation shifted to Emily. "I don't know how you do it, Mum," Sarah said. "After everything she's done, I don't think I'd be able to look at her, let alone help her." Her words weren't bitter, they were honest. "She hurt me in ways I can't even explain," she continued. "And sometimes I feel like she still doesn't get it." I nodded, letting her vent. "You're right," I said. "She doesn't. I don't fully get it, and I don't know if she ever will. But I also know she's my daughter, and as much as she's hurt you and me, I can't just walk away from her." Sarah sighed. "I get it. I don't like it, but I get it." That conversation marked a turning point for us. While things weren't perfect, it felt like a step toward healing. I promised her I would always. I promised I'd look after her mental health and that I'd make sure Emily didn't get in the way of her progress. I meant it. Meanwhile, Emily was struggling. The reality of single motherhood had hit her hard. Without Jake's financial support, she was barely scraping by. She eventually found a part-time job at a local grocery store. But it wasn't enough to cover all her expenses. She called me one evening in tears, saying how hard it was and that she felt like a failure. She said she didn't know how she was supposed to do this. I wanted to tell her that this was the consequence of her choices, but I held back. Instead, I reminded her of the resources I'd given her, like programs for single mothers and legal aid. For her divorce, even therapy services. "You have tools, Emily," I said. "You just need to use them." But her pride got in the way. She didn't want to ask for help from anyone but me. And I wasn't willing to be her crutch anymore. It was tough love, but it was necessary. Slowly she started taking more responsibility. It wasn't a perfect transformation. There were a few hiccups along the way, like moments where she lashed out or fell back into old patterns. But overall, things were moving in the right direction. On the other hand, Alex had completely cut ties with Emily. He refused to answer her calls or even acknowledge her existence. I didn't agree with his approach, but I respected his decision. Everyone had their own way of coping, and this was his. As for the extended family, most of them stayed distant from Emily as well. Some openly voiced their disapproval of her actions, while others simply avoided her altogether. One of my sisters, who had been close to Emily growing up, told me, "I love you. I don't agree with what she did to Sarah, but maybe someday I'll be able to support her." She didn't talk about Jake much anymore, except to say that the divorce was finalized and he'd moved out of state. Someone new, a kind, patient man who treated her the way she deserved to be treated. When she introduced him to me and my husband, I saw something in her I hadn't seen in years: hope. It was a reminder that healing was possible, even after the deepest wounds. As for me, I've learned to accept that my family will never be what it once was. There's no fixing it. This isn't how I initially hoped it would be, but that doesn't mean we can't move forward. It just means we have to redefine what moving forward looks like. I still see Emily occasionally, mostly for the sake of the kids. They're beautiful and bright little souls who remind me that despite all the pain, there's still joy to be found. Sarah hasn't spoken to Emily. Since everything blew up, I've learned that healing looks different for everyone. It's not my place to tell anyone what that should look like. In the end, I don't know if I made all the right choices. I'm sure there are things I could have handled better, things I should have said or done differently, but I did the best I could with the hand I was dealt. I think that's all any of us can do. If you're struggling with family issues, know that it's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to prioritize your own mental health. And it's okay to let go of the idea that things will ever go back to the way they were. Sometimes moving forward means letting go. And that's okay.